right before the United States bombed Serbia, the Congress got together. The United States Congress got together and debated on whether or not the U.S. should arm the KLA. Now, the KLA was the Kosovo Liberation Army. These guys were thugs, they were drug dealers, they were major criminal operatives who played a huge role in drug trafficking in Europe. And these guys were no good. They were murderers, they were assassins, they were involved in organs trafficking. They were literally kidnapping people and murdering them for their organs. So, knowing that these people were scum and that they were evil and no good, the Congress got together and debated on whether or not the KLA should be armed by the U.S. government. Do you know who supported arming the KLA? Mitch McConnell, John McCain, and Joseph Lieberman. I'm not surprised by this at all, because John McCain would, years later, support arming the criminal, murderous rebels in Syria. And I remember years ago when the Syrian civil war first began, it was something that was brand new in the headlines. There was a video of a bunch of rebels, and one of them was screaming, "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar," and John McCain was asked about this, and John McCain said, well, Allahu Akbar is the equivalent to saying God bless. It's no big deal. When it was blatantly obvious that he was supporting terrorist thugs. So John McCain supporting the KLA, not a surprise at all. It's not a surprise. And there was some other people who supported the arming of the KLA, William Cohen, and also Henry Shelton. Also Elliot Engel. And what these American politicians wanted to do was basically spend $25 million on weapons for the KLA. And this money would have been used to arm 10,000 KLA fighters. And yet another example of American officials wanting to support terrorists. And it's usually the same crowd, right? John McCain going to the Euromaidan and speaking and sharing a platform with Tihanibuk, the leader of Svoboda, the Nazi party in Ukraine. John McCain supporting Syrian rebels. John McCain supporting Albanian terrorists, the KLA. And here we see Joseph Lieberman also supporting the arming of the KLA in the late 1990s. This happened, this discussion, this discourse within the U.S. Congress took place in 1999, in April of 1999, right before the bombing of Serbia, which began in May of that very year. So I want to tell you guys something about Joseph Lieberman, because this whole thing is ironic and disturbing. So years ago, back in the 20-teens, my father was invited to speak at a major event, Christian event, organized by a group known as Christians United for Israel. It's better known as its acronym CUFI, C-U-F-I, CUFI. And CUFI is still around, and it's led by a pastor named John Hagee, who within recent years, within the past probably 10 years or so, has been declining tremendously and is really no longer as popular as he used to be. He used to be very popular. He wrote a book called Jerusalem Countdown years and years ago. And it was a bestseller, sold 1 million copies. And that was back in the early 2000s. That was a long, long time ago. And John Hagee has been declining ever since. And now he's really no longer famous. He really isn't. His sermons don't get really that many views on YouTube. He's a shadow of his former empire. So my father gets invited to this event organized by Christians United for Israel, which at that time was a big event, right? At that time, it would have attracted thousands of people to come and join the audience. So my father was invited. He accepted the invitation, and the Kufi was advertising the event, saying that Walid Shubat, my father, will be speaking, etc., etc. And they sold a whole bunch of tickets. They sold a lot of tickets for this event. And then in the last moment, they canceled on my father. They told my father not to show up. Why? Because Joseph Lieberman was invited to the event, and Joseph Lieberman did not want to share a platform with my father because he was afraid it would be too controversial. So they acquiesced to the peer pressure that was being fomented, and they canceled my father. Now, the peer pressure was being fomented by a guy named David Brog. David Brog is a Jewish man who was working with Kufi at the time. He was sort of the spokesperson of Christians United for Israel. He was not a Christian. He still is not a Christian. And he was one of the ones working with organizing the events for Kufi. And David Brog said, well, we don't want Joseph Lieberman sharing a platform with Walid Shubat because Walid Shubat is a very controversial figure. My father was very critical of Islam. My father was someone who shared his faith all the time, talked a lot about the Bible. And David Brog basically said, well, we don't want someone like that sharing a platform with this big congressman, Joseph Lieberman. And so they canceled on my father. They used my father, and the reason why they canceled on my dad on the last second was because they were simply using my dad to sell tickets. They used my father to say, Walid Shubat will be coming to town, buy tickets, come listen to him speak. A bunch of people bought tickets, and then once they got enough ticket sales, they canceled on my dad. And that's what happened. Because they knew that just advertising that Joseph Lieberman will be in town would not really be, it wouldn't be a huge selling point. Who gives a damn about Joseph Lieberman, right? Nobody cared. He was a Democrat, and conservative Christians weren't going to be interested in buying tickets to listen to him talk. Plus, he's a terrible speaker. But Walid Shubat, my father, was very, very popular at that time. My father was popular enough to gather a huge crowd for a building. My father used to speak at universities, and the entire auditorium for a university would be filled, would be packed. People would literally be outside of the auditorium to hear my dad talk at a university. So they knew that my father was important for marketing and nothing beyond that. What's so crazy is that they canceled on my father, who was going to be talking about terrorism, because they wanted to please a man who supported terrorists. Joseph Lieberman supported terrorists. He supported the KLA. My father was against terrorism. My father was against the United States' support for terrorists. My father was talking about the Bosnian Mujahideen, the Chechen Mujahideen, the Albanian Mujahideen. My father talked a lot, actually, about this subject because my father's grandfather was close friends with Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, back at the time when Hitler was ruling Germany. And the Mufti supported the Bosnian and the Albanian Mujahideen. And so my father, knowing this history, talked about the Balkan Mujahideen. My father talked about the Albanian terrorists and the Bosnian terrorists and the Grand Mufti and how they were literal SS units that were made up of Albanian and Bosnian Islamists. My father talked about all these things. My father was against such evils. Joseph Lieberman wasn't. And a Christian organization canceled on my father to please a man who supported terrorists. They canceled on a man who was speaking against terrorism to appeal to a man who supported terrorism. And this was being done by a Christian Zionist organization. Not surprised at all. None of this surprises me. And the evils of the United States government permeates into the Christian industry of America. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.